The muddy water hit Opal like a breaking wave, drenching her from head to toe in a single calculated moment. The cream-colored dress, the one she'd chosen specifically for its elegance, its understated grace, was ruined instantly, transformed into a canvas of brown splatters and soaking fabric that clung to her skin. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the wet pavement with a crack that echoed the breaking of something else entirely. The white SUV didn't just hit the puddle, it aimed for it. Opal had seen the vehicle approaching, watched as it slowed slightly, not to avoid the trench of rainwater pooled along Savannah's historic district curb, but to position itself perfectly. The driver's side window descended with mechanical precision. Inside, a man in an expensive silk tie smirked at her through the glass, his eyes meeting hers for one deliberate second before his foot slammed the accelerator. The laugh came next. High-pitched, shrill, deliberately cruel. "Look at her!" A woman's voice shrieked from the passenger seat, piercing through the humid Georgia air. "Still standing on the curb while we're driving the future." The SUV's tires kicked up another spray as it peeled away, the woman's cackle trailing behind like exhaust fumes. Opal stood frozen, muddy water dripping from her hair, her chin, the hem of her dress. Around her, pedestrians stopped and stared. Someone's phone was pointed in her direction. The humiliation wasn't just private. It was documented, witnessed, recorded for posterity. But Opal didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. Her body trembled, not from the cold water soaking through to her skin, but from something else entirely. Something that looked like fury compressed into absolute stillness. Her hands, which had instinctively reached for balance, slowly lowered to her sides. Her breathing steadied, and in the rear-view mirror of that disappearing SUV, the man who had just destroyed her dress caught one final glimpse of her face. He saw shock. He missed the calculation. They had no idea that the woman they'd just humiliated was Opal Kwan, primary shareholder of Black Crane Logistics, the $50 million partnership Marlon Vance had been desperately chasing for 8 months. The only lifeline standing between his company, Vance Global, and complete bankruptcy. What would Marlon's face reveal when he discovered the truth? Would Opal show mercy to the man who had abandoned her with nothing? What would you do? Before we dive deeper into this story of calculated revenge, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Are you Team Opal, or do you think she should show mercy? Drop your location and your thoughts below. We read every single comment. And if you don't subscribe, tell us why. We genuinely want to know what would make these stories even better for you. The man driving that SUV was Marlon Vance. 3 years ago, he had been Opal's husband. Not a good husband. Not even an adequate one. But legally, contractually, he had been hers. Until the morning he sat her down at their cramped kitchen table in their Jersey City apartment and told her she was too stagnant for his trajectory. "I'm going places, Opal," he'd said, his voice clinical, detached, like he was firing an underperforming employee rather than ending a marriage. "You're comfortable, complacent. I need someone who matches my ambition." He'd left her with the lease she couldn't afford, the credit card debt he'd racked up building his network, the car payment on a vehicle he took with him. For 6 months after the divorce, Opal worked 3 jobs just to keep her head above water: morning shift at a hospital, afternoon data entry, weekend catering gigs where she smiled at people who looked through her like she was furniture. Marlon, meanwhile, had moved on spectacularly. His new wife, Symphony, was everything he'd accused Opal of not being. Hungry, ambitious, sharp-edged and status-obsessed, with a laugh that could cut glass and a social media presence that screamed new money trying desperately to look like old money. She wore designers Opal had never heard of. She took selfies in first-class lounges. She posted quotes about leveling up and cutting dead weight that Marlon would like and repost, each one a small knife twisted into the memory of what Opal had once been to him. Together, they were insufferable. Separately, they were dangerous, the kind of people who mistook ruthlessness for intelligence, cruelty for strength. And now, they were in Savannah, with a singular purpose: to secure a partnership with Kwan Beom Seok. Marlon had been chasing this deal for 8 months. 8 months of unanswered emails, of proposals submitted and rejected without explanation, of sleepless nights staring at his company's balance sheets and watching the numbers bleed red. Vance Global was drowning. The pivot to international logistics had been Marlin's big play. Nice his proof that he was more than a mid-level operations manager with delusions of grandeur. But the pivot required infrastructure he didn't have, contacts he hadn't earned, and most critically, access to ports along the eastern seaboard that were controlled, quietly, absolutely, by Black Crane Logistics. On paper, Black Crane was a shipping company. Legitimate, profitable, boring even in its corporate filings and quarterly reports. In reality, Black Crane was an empire, and its emperor was Kwon Byung-seok, a man the underworld called the Iron Tiger. Korean-born, Atlanta-raised, Seoul-educated, Byung-seok had built his reputation on two principles: absolute loyalty to those who earned it, and absolute destruction for those who betrayed it. He didn't make threats. He didn't need to. When Byung-seok decided you were a problem, you simply stopped being relevant. Marlin knew none of this, of course. He knew Byung-seok was powerful, that securing this partnership would save Vance Global, that this was his last chance before the creditors came calling. What Marlin didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that every proposal he'd submitted, every carefully crafted pitch deck, every financial projection, had landed on the desk of the company's primary shareholder, a woman named Opal Kwon, his ex-wife, the woman he'd just drenched in mud. Back on that savannah curb, Opal bent slowly to retrieve her shattered phone. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, but it still worked. She pulled up a contact, no name, just a series of numbers, and typed a message with deliberate precision. "He's here, just like you said he'd be. And he still doesn't recognize me." The response came in seconds. "Good. I'll see you at the gala. Wear the obsidian." Opal looked down at her ruined dress, at the mud still dripping onto the historic Savannah sidewalk, at the strangers still staring with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. She felt the weight of her wedding ring, not the cheap band Marlin had given her, but the platinum one with the black diamond that currently sat in a vault, the one that represented a marriage built not on desperation, but on mutual salvation. 2 years ago, in an Atlanta hospital, Opal had been working a night shift when they brought in a man with 3 gunshot wounds. No ID, no insurance information, just blood, so much blood, and eyes that stayed conscious through agony that should have rendered him comatose. "So don't call the police," he'd whispered in Korean, a language Opal spoke fluently but rarely used. "Please." She should have called them anyway, should have followed protocol. But something in his face, not fear but calculation, the same expression she'd worn when Marlin had left her with nothing, made her pause. Opal had stitched him up in a supply closet, using skills she'd learned growing up in a family of doctors, skills that had atrophied during her marriage to a man who thought her nursing degree was cute, but not particularly useful. She'd kept him hidden for 3 days, sneaking him food, changing his bandages, watching him heal with a resilience that seemed almost supernatural. When he was strong enough to leave, he'd pressed a business card into her hand. Black Crane Logistics. No name, just a phone number. "If you ever need anything," he'd said, "call this number. You saved my life. That is a debt that cannot be repaid, only honored." 6 months later, when Opal's landlord had started eviction proceedings, when the debt collectors were calling hourly, when she'd stood on the edge of giving up entirely, she'd called that number. The man who answered was Kwon Byung-seok, and he'd asked her one question: "What do you need?" What Opal had needed was a job. What she'd gotten was an empire. Byung-seok had hired her as a consultant, a deliberately vague title that allowed her access to everything. He'd taught her the business, introduced her to the network, shown her how power actually worked when you stopped apologizing for wanting it. And somewhere in those late nights, reviewing shipping manifests, and early mornings walking Savannah's ports, where something had shifted between them, he'd proposed on a rooftop in Seoul, with the city lights spread below them like scattered diamonds. "I don't believe in love at first sight," he'd said, his English careful, accented. "But I believe in recognition. I recognized you the moment you chose to save me instead of following rules. Marry me not because you love me yet, but because you respect what we could build together. Opal had said yes, not because she loved him, not yet, though that would come, but because Kwon Byung-seok was the first person who had ever looked at her and seen potential instead of convenience. Now, standing on a savannah curb in a ruined dress, Opal allowed herself a small, dark smile. Marlon was in town for a gala, a networking event where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen, where deals were made over whiskey and influence traded like currency, an event hosted by Black Crane Logistics, an event where Marlon would finally meet the elusive Kwon Byung-seok, the man whose partnership could save his failing company. An event where Opal would be standing beside her husband, wearing obsidian silk and carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned every ounce of her power. Marlon had splashed her with mud, laughed at her humiliation, driven away, convinced he'd won some final, petty victory over the woman he'd discarded. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that he'd just committed an act of public cruelty against the one person who held his entire future in her hands. And Opal Kwon had an excellent memory. She glanced at her watch. 2 hours until the gala. Enough time to go home, shower. She'd transform. Enough time for Marlon to arrive at the Hyatt Regency Ballroom, confident and ignorant, searching for the man who could save him. Enough time for the Iron Tiger to ask his wife a single question. Who did it? And enough time for Opal to point across a crowded room and say, with perfect calm, him. 2 hours later, the Hyatt Regency Ballroom had been transformed into a temple of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers hung from cathedral ceilings like frozen explosions of light, each one worth more than most people's annual salaries. The floor was Italian marble, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the designer gowns and bespoke suits of Savannah's elite. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the historic district, the view itself a reminder that this room, this event, these people, existed above the ordinary world. See, the air was thick with expensive cologne and the particular silence that only old money could afford. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of voices so accustomed to being heard that they never needed to rise above a murmur. Waiters moved like ghosts, their trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres appearing and disappearing with choreographed precision. This was power's natural habitat. Marlon Vance entered the ballroom like a man walking into his destiny. He'd changed into his best suit, a charcoal Tom Ford that had cost him 3 months of inflated credit card payments. His shoes were polished to a gleam. His tie was Windsor knotted with military precision. Beside him, Symphony wore a red cocktail dress that screamed for attention, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown timer. There are at least 4 Fortune 500 CEOs in this room, Symphony whispered, her eyes scanning the crowd with predatory focus. Marlon, if we play this right, Byung-seok won't be the only connection we make tonight. Marlon nodded, but his attention was singular. He hadn't spent 8 months, hadn't leveraged every asset, hadn't mortgaged his future for networking. He was here for one man. Kwon Byung-seok, the Iron Tiger, the man whose signature would transform Vance Global from a struggling logistics company into a legitimate player in international shipping. Marlon's eyes swept the ballroom, cataloging faces, dismissing irrelevance. A city councilman, a real estate developer, a federal judge. Important people, certainly, but not his people. Not tonight. And then he saw him. At the far end of the ballroom, Len standing near the windows like he owned not just the room, but the view itself, was a man whose presence seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. Kwon Byung-seok wore a midnight blue suit that probably cost more than Marlon's car. The car he'd bought to look successful, to project the image of a man who belonged in rooms like this. The suit was cut with such precision that it seemed architectural, designed to make its wearer look not just wealthy, but inevitable. His face was an unreadable mask of stoicism, his posture military straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. But it was his eyes that truly commanded. Dark, calculating, completely devoid of the false warmth that most powerful people deployed like a social lubricant. When Byung-seok looked at someone, you got the sense he was seeing not who you pretended to be, but who you actually were, stripped of pretense, evaluated with surgical precision, and either accepted or dismissed in the span of a heartbeat. Around him stood 4 men in identical black suits, their earpieces barely visible, their stance textbook security detail. They weren't looking at the crowd with the bored surveillance of typical bodyguards. They were watching like men who expected violence and were prepared to deliver it. "That's him," Marlon breathed, his pulse quickening. Symphony grabbed his arm. "Remember what we practiced. Confidence, authority. You're not asking for a favor. You're offering an opportunity." Marlon nodded, rolling his shoulders back, lifting his chin. He'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. The approach, the handshake, the opening line that would establish him as a peer rather than a supplicant. But he moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his smile calibrated to project friendly professionalism. As he walked, he passed a waiter, young, probably college-aged, struggling slightly with a tray of champagne flutes. "Watch it!" Marlon snapped as the waiter nearly brushed his shoulder. He didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge the kid's mumbled apology. In his peripheral vision, he caught Symphony's approving nod. "Good. Can't show weakness. Can't let anyone think you're the kind of man who apologizes to the help." They crossed the ballroom, and with each step, Marlon felt his confidence building. He'd earned this moment. 8 months of persistence, of refining his pitch, of positioning Vance Global as the scrappy underdog with unlimited potential. He was wearing the right suit, saying the right things, projecting the right energy. He was ready. Marlon stopped 3 feet from Kwan Beom-seok, his hand already extending, his smile already deployed. "Mr. Kwan," he said, his voice pitched to carry authority without arrogance. "A pleasure to finally meet you in person. I'm Marlon Vance, CEO of Vance Global. We spoke via—" Beom-seok didn't take his hand. He didn't even look at Marlon's face. His attention was fixed somewhere past Marlon's shoulder, toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. His expression, already unreadable, somehow became more so, as if he'd pulled a curtain across something that had been barely visible to begin with. Marlon's hand hung in the air, his smile starting to falter. Symphony shifted beside him, her own confidence wavering like a candle flame in a draft. "Mr. Kwan?" Marlon tried again, his voice climbing half an octave despite his best efforts. "So, I know you're a busy man, but I was hoping we could—" "You are late," Beom-seok said. His voice was a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate in Marlon's chest. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never been ignored. But Beom-seok wasn't talking to Marlon. Marlon turned, following the man's gaze, expecting to see another business associate, maybe a board member, maybe someone from Black Crane's executive team who had been delayed by traffic or too many drinks at the hotel bar. Instead, the crowd began to part. Not naturally, not casually, but with the deliberate choreography of people who recognized the presence of someone significant. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The ballroom's ambient noise, that expensive murmur of the elite at leisure, dropped by several decibels. Walking toward them, moving through the parted crowd like a queen processing through her court, was a woman who looked like a celestial event. She wore a floor-length gown of obsidian silk that caught the light from the chandeliers and seemed to absorb it, turning illumination into shadow, transforming brightness into something darker and infinitely more compelling. The dress was cut with architectural precision, high-necked, long-sleeved, revealing nothing and somehow suggesting everything. Her hair was styled in an intricate crown of braids and pins, each strand precisely placed, the overall effect both regal and slightly dangerous. But it was her bearing that truly commanded attention. She didn't walk like someone entering a party. She walked like someone who owned the building, the city, the very air that everyone else was breathing. Her posture was perfect without being rigid. Her pace was measured without being slow. And her expression, calm, composed, almost bored, suggested that this room full of Savannah's most powerful people was merely one more obligation in a very long day. Marlon stared, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Because he knew that face, he knew that walk, he knew the exact angle of that jawline, the specific arch of those eyebrows, the precise shade of those eyes that he'd once looked into across a kitchen table and called too stagnant for his future. Opal! The name fell out of his mouth like a stone dropping into still water. Symphony's hand tightened on his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit. What the hell is she doing here? The woman. Opal. It was definitely Opal, but somehow not the Opal that Marlon remembered, stopped walking when she was still 15 feet away. She didn't acknowledge Marlon, didn't even glance in his direction. Her attention was fixed entirely on Kwon Beom-seok, and something in her expression, something soft, something almost affectionate, transformed her face from merely beautiful into something that made Marlon's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. I had an incident with the local wildlife, she said, her voice smooth as aged bourbon, rich with amusement and something darker underneath. Nothing I couldn't handle. She closed the distance between herself and Beom-seok, and Marlon watched, his mouth dry, his heart hammering, his entire understanding of reality beginning to crack like ice under pressure, as the Iron Tiger's face underwent a transformation that seemed almost miraculous. The cold mask melted, the hard eyes softened, and Kwon Beom-seok, the man rumored to have personally dismantled 3 rival syndicates in Seoul, the man whose reputation was built on ruthless efficiency and absolute lack of mercy, reached out with a gentleness that seemed to violate the laws of physics and tucked a stray hair behind Opal's ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. His eyes, those calculating, merciless eyes, looked at her with something that resembled worship. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice losing its hard edge, becoming something almost tender. "My dignity more than my body," Opal replied, "but both will survive." Beom-seok's hand moved to her shoulder, his thumb brushing across her collarbone in a gesture so intimate, so proprietary, that Marlon felt like he was watching something obscene. And then the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Who did it?" Beom-seok asked. The tenderness vanished from his voice like someone had thrown a switch. What replaced it was something cold and sharp and absolutely terrifying, a promise of violence wrapped in professional courtesy, a threat that didn't need to be explicit because everyone in that ballroom, from the waiters to the CEOs, could feel it pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Opal's eyes finally moved from her companion's face. They landed on Marlon. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked like a scientist observing an insect under glass, interested in a detached, clinical way, like curious about what would happen when certain stimuli were applied. "A man in a white SUV," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. "He seemed to be in quite a hurry, didn't even slow down when he saw the puddle." She paused, and something that might have been a smile flickered across her lips. "Actually, I believe he's standing right here." If you're loving this moment of justice, smash that subscribe button. My Afro-Korean Boss Stories brings you the most satisfying revenge tales every single week. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now. And if you're not subscribing, drop a comment telling us why. We genuinely want to make these stories perfect for you. Symphony gasped, an actual theatrical gasp that would have been funny under different circumstances. Her face drained of color, transitioning from its carefully contoured glow to a sickly shade of gray that no amount of expensive foundation could hide. Her hand, still gripping Marlon's arm, began to tremble. Marlon's own hand, the one that had been extended in greeting and then forgotten, still hanging in the air like a broken promise, started to shake. His brain was struggling to reconcile 2 incompatible realities. The Opal he remembered, the one who had stood in their cramped Jersey apartment, looking small and defeated, and this woman, this queen in obsidian silk, who stood beside Kwon Beom-seok like she'd been born to occupy that exact space. "Opal?" The word came out strangled, desperate. "What is this? What are you—" He turned to Beom-seok, forcing his face into something resembling professional confusion. "Mr. Kwon, there must be some mistake. This is my ex-wife. She's a nobody. The look Kwon Beom-seok gave Marlon stopped the words in his throat. It was the look a butcher gives a carcass. Not with hatred. Hatred would have implied some level of emotional investment. This was pure assessment. The cold evaluation of meat, of something that had already been categorized, weighed, and found wanting. Bomseok took a step forward, then another. His security detail moved with him, a synchronized shadow that made the already considerable space around them expand further as other guests instinctively backed away. He stopped when he was inches from Marlon's face, close enough that Marlon could smell his cologne, something expensive and vaguely threatening, close enough that Marlon had to fight every instinct to step back, to run, to escape the gravitational pull of this man's presence. To you, Byung-suk said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom. She was a wife you discarded, a woman you deemed insufficient for your trajectory. The word dripped with contempt. To me, she is the woman who saved my life when I was wounded in a hit in Atlanta 2 years ago. The woman who risked her career, her safety, her freedom to stitch my wounds in a hospital supply closet when calling the police would have been easier. Safer. The professional thing to do. He paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. To the world, Byung-seok continued, his eyes never leaving Marlon's face. She is the primary shareholder of Black Crane Logistics. The ballroom might as well have been underwater. Marlon couldn't hear anything except his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. His vision tunneled. His lungs forgot how to process air. Primary shareholder? The words came out as a whisper, as if speaking them any louder would make them more real. I don't own the company, Marlon, Byung-seok said, and now he did step back, just far enough to make Marlon feel both relief and exposure. I manage it, for my wife. The word landed like a physical blow. Wife. Marlon's eyes darted to Opal's left hand. There, on her ring finger, sat a platinum band with a black diamond that probably cost more than every piece of jewelry he'd ever bought for her, for anyone, combined. How had he not seen it before? How had he looked at this woman and not recognized? You wanted a partnership, Byung-seok continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than the cold fury. You've been sending proposals to Black Crane for 6 months, 23 proposals to be exact, each one more desperate than the last, each one promising us access to markets you don't control, relationships you don't have, capabilities you can't deliver. Marlon's knees threatened to give out. I didn't know she was reviewing them? Opal's voice cut through his stammering. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside her husband, her posture mirroring his, united, unified, unbreakable. Every single one of them landed on my desk, Marlon, the primary shareholder's desk, and I rejected every single one. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study a particularly interesting specimen in a museum. The first few I rejected on merit. Your proposals were sloppy, overpromising, built on infrastructure you didn't have, and connections you couldn't prove. But the later ones... She paused, and now something that definitely was a smile. Dark, satisfied, razor-sharp, crossed her face. The later ones I rejected because I recognized your name, and I wanted to see how far you'd fall before you realized you were falling. Symphony made a sound, half sob, half gasp. Marlon, what is she talking about? You said this deal was a sure thing. You said we just needed to make the connection, that the proposals were already approved, that... Symphony. Opal turned her attention to the younger woman, and Symphony actually flinched. That's your name, isn't it? Symphony. Like a musical composition. How fitting. So much sound. Like so little substance. Opal took a step toward Symphony, close enough that Marlon's new wife, his upgrade, his reward for cutting dead weight, had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I liked the laugh, Opal said softly. Back on the curb. When your husband drenched me in muddy water, and you laughed like it was the funniest thing you'd ever seen, it had a lovely, hollow ring to it. She paused, her smile widening just a fraction. Just like your bank account will have by tomorrow morning. What? Symphony's voice broke. What are you talking about? Wait. Marlon's brain was finally catching up, finally processing the full scope of the disaster unfolding around him. He held up his hands in a gesture that was meant to be placating, but came across as pleading. Opal, let's be reasonable. We have history. So I can explain the puddle. It was an accident. I didn't see you there. I didn't recognize. The puddle was an accident, Opal agreed, her voice still maddeningly calm, still radiating that infuriating control. But the embezzlement wasn't. The word dropped into the ballroom like a grenade. Marlon froze. Actually froze, every muscle in his body locking simultaneously, his face going slack, with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, denial, and then, as the implications crystallized, pure, primal terror. I don't know what you're. You see, Opal continued, speaking over him as if he hadn't said anything at all. I knew you'd be coming to Savannah. I knew you'd be desperate enough to make one final push for this partnership. And I know you, Marlon. I was married to you for 3 years. So I know exactly the kind of man you are when you're desperate. She glanced at her husband. Byung-seok nodded once, a minimal gesture, and one of his security detail, a man who looked like he could break concrete with his forehead, stepped forward and produced a sleek silver tablet. The screen lit up, bright in the ballroom's carefully calibrated lighting. So I had my husband's associates look into Vance Global, Opal said, taking the tablet and turning it so Marlon could see. Really look into it, the kind of deep forensic analysis that proper due diligence requires. We found some interesting things. On the screen were bank statements, account numbers, transaction histories that Marlon recognized with the sick certainty of a man watching his own execution. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Opal narrated, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Registered under shell corporations that trace back to your personal LLC. Funds that should have been reported to the IRS, but mysteriously weren't. Money that was supposed to be invested in Vance Global's operations, but instead went to... She scrolled through the documents. A luxury SUV, a vacation property in the Hamptons that you can't afford. Symphony's engagement ring, 3 carats, princess cut, purchased with money you embezzled from your own company. Symphony made a choking sound. You said you got a bonus. You said... We also found, Opal continued, ignoring Symphony entirely, the documents you forged during our divorce, the ones where you hid your 401k by transferring it to an account under your mother's name, the ones where you claimed our marital assets were worth $40,000 when they were actually worth $340,000, the ones you used to ensure I walked away with less than half of nothing while you kept everything. Marlon's vision was blurring. His hands had gone numb. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. Those accounts were hidden, protected, carefully structured to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking with the resources of an international logistics company with connections to every financial institution in the Western Hemisphere. Opal finished, as if reading his thoughts. Yes, Marlon. Turns out it's very hard to hide money from people who move billions of dollars across international borders every single day. Byung-seok took the tablet back from his wife and turned it to show a different screen, this one showing a live feed from what appeared to be a security camera. The Hyatt Regency's front entrance. 2 Savannah Police Department vehicles, lights flashing. 4 officers climbing out and walking toward the hotel's main doors. In the Mafia, Byung-seok said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the ballroom to lean in, to strain to hear. We have certain principles, certain codes. One of the most important is respect for family. A man who treats his first wife like trash, who steals from her, who leaves her with debt while he upgrades to a newer model. He paused, his eyes moving from Marlon to Symphony and back again. That man cannot be trusted with a cargo ship. He cannot be trusted with a shipping route. He certainly cannot be trusted with a legacy. The ballroom remained silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Every eye was fixed on the scene unfolding in the center of the marble floor. The powerful man in the midnight blue suit, the woman in obsidian silk, and the 2 people whose entire world was collapsing in real time. Mr. Kwan, please! Marlon's voice broke. I can explain. I can fix this. I can... You recognized her, Byung-seok said. Back on that curb. You saw her face before you aimed your vehicle at that puddle. You recognized your ex-wife, and you made a choice. Not an accidental choice, not a split-second decision. You deliberately positioned your vehicle, so deliberately accelerated, deliberately humiliated a woman you once promised to honor. He stepped closer again, and this time Marlon did step back, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Byom-seok finished. The ballroom doors opened. 2 police officers entered, their uniforms a stark contrast to the evening wear surrounding them. They moved through the crowd with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced, their hands resting casually on their belts, their eyes scanning until they found what they were looking for. Symphony began to scream. Not a dignified objection, not a controlled protest. A full-throated, desperate scream that echoed off the cathedral ceilings and shattered the last pretense of civilization. This is his fault, she shrieked, pointing at Marlon with a shaking hand. I didn't know about any of it. The accounts, the fraud, She turned to the approaching officers. I'm a victim here. He lied to me. I thought the money was legitimate. Ma'am, you're going to need to calm down, one of the officers said, his hand moving from his belt to a more purposeful position. Don't tell me to calm down. Symphony's voice climbed another octave. Do you know who I am? Do you know what this will do to my reputation? I have a social media following. I have brand partnerships. I can't be arrested. I can't. The second officer moved to Marlon, who stood frozen, his face slack, his eyes unfocused. Marlon Vance. Marlon didn't respond. Couldn't respond. He was watching Opal, watching the way she stood beside her husband, watching the way she looked at him, not with triumph, not with gloating satisfaction, but with something far worse. Indifference. The look one gives a stranger, a nobody. Mr. Vance, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. The words seemed to come from very far away. Marlon's body moved automatically, muscle memory from some distant part of his brain that was still functioning, while the rest of him tried to process the magnitude of his destruction. The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent ballroom. Opal reached into her clutch, a small, elegant thing that probably cost more than the entire outfit Marlon was wearing, and pulled out a small, mud-stained handkerchief. The one she must have used to wipe her face after he'd drenched her. The one she'd kept deliberately as evidence. She walked toward Marlon, her heels clicking against the marble with measured precision. She stopped in front of him, so close he could smell her perfume. Something sophisticated and expensive that he'd never smelled on her before, because the Opal he'd known couldn't afford perfume like this. She dropped the handkerchief at his feet. Clean yourself up, Marlon, she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom with perfect clarity. You look like you've been dragged through the dirt. Are you loving this? Subscribe to my Afro-Korean boss stories if you believe karma is real. If you don't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. We read every single one, and your feedback shapes our next stories. We genuinely want to know what would make these even better for you. The officers began to lead Marlon toward the ballroom doors, his expensive shoes dragging against the marble. Symphony followed, still screaming, her voice raw as she cycled through denial and blame. I want a lawyer! Marlon, tell them I didn't know anything. But Marlon wasn't listening. He was staring at Opal with an expression beyond fear, the look of someone watching their entire reality collapse. Opal leaned into Byom-seok's side, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Byom-seok, dear, did you handle the car? Byom-seok's hand moved protectively to her back. The SUV has been repossessed. The bank was very cooperative. They'll be walking to the station. Symphony's scream reached a new pitch. Walking! It's 3 miles. In these heels? The officers reached the doors, and one turned to address the crowd. Folks, we apologize for the disruption. Please continue your evening. A string quartet began playing, transforming the arrest into merely an interruption. The crowd dispersed, conversations resuming with practiced ease. This was Savannah's elite. They'd seen fortunes lost before. But Marlon found his voice. Opal, please. We can fix this. I can pay you back. The divorce money, the debt, all of it. Just give me a chance. Opal tilted her head, considering. For one brief moment, Marlon allowed himself hope. You know what's interesting, Marlon? Opal took a step toward him. When you left me, when you called me too stagnant, I was devastated. Not because I loved you, but because I believed you. I saw exactly what you said. Comfortable, complacent, unambitious. She maintained careful distance. For months, I worked 3 jobs, ate ramen, wore the same 5 outfits, and every day, I wondered if you were right about me. Her voice hardened. But then I saved a man's life, and he didn't see me as stagnant. He saw potential, capability, someone worth building with. Opal glanced at Beomsiak, who watched with quiet devotion. So, here's what's interesting. You were right about one thing. I was too stagnant for your trajectory. Because your trajectory was always going to end here, in handcuffs, in ruins, and I was never going to follow you down. Marlon's mouth opened, but no words came. As for making it right. Opal's voice dropped. Marlon, you can't. What you stole wasn't just money. It was 3 years of my life, my confidence, my belief that I deserved basic human dignity. She pulled out a folded paper. This is our divorce settlement. The one where you claimed our assets were worth $40,000 while hiding $300,000. The one where you forged documents to ensure I got nothing. She refolded it precisely. I've had this for 6 months, since my husband's accountants found your offshore accounts. I could have destroyed you quietly, but I wanted you to know. I wanted you to see my face when it happened. Symphony had stopped screaming, mascara running down her face. You're a monster, she whispered. Opal's eyebrows rose. Am I? For holding accountable a man who stole from me, humiliated me, treated me like garbage. She addressed the entire ballroom. Marlon Vance believes he's a victim, that this is unfair. Maybe some of you think the same thing. The room went silent. But here's what happened. 2 hours ago, this man saw me on a curb. He recognized me, his ex-wife, and he made a choice. He positioned his vehicle, aimed for the puddle, and accelerated. Deliberately, with his wife laughing, because he wanted to prove he'd won our divorce. She paused. That moment tells you everything about his character. Not the embezzlement or fraud. The puddle. Because it was unnecessary cruelty, and cruelty for its own sake is the truest measure of who someone is. Marlon felt tears burning, not remorse, but rage at the unfairness. The numbers don't lie, Mr. Vance, Beomsiak said. Your company is $2.3 million in debt. 14 employees will lose jobs when Vance Global files for bankruptcy next week. Vendors won't be paid. Clients won't receive shipments. He stepped forward. All of that was already happening. You were failing. The partnership wasn't an opportunity. It was a Hail Mary from a drowning man. And you were never going to get it. His eyes narrowed. But you could have failed with dignity. Instead, you chose to steal, to lie, to humiliate. Now you won't just lose your company. You'll lose your freedom, your reputation, your future. The officers moved again, pulling them toward the doors. As the doors opened, revealing the lobby and waiting police cars, Opal called out, Oh, and Marlon, the lawyer you'll need? His retainer is $50,000. I checked. Thought you should know. The doors closed, muffling Symphony's sobs. The ballroom felt different after the doors closed. The energy had shifted, charged like static before a storm. Opal stood holding Beomsiak's hand, her heart racing despite her apparent calm. The adrenaline was ebbing, leaving exhaustion mixed with vindication. Are you all right? Beomsiak asked quietly. I'm all right, Opal said, surprised it was true. I just feel tired. Justice is exhausting, Beomsiak said. You did well. We should leave, Opal said, glancing at faces still watching them with new understanding of who she was. Beomsiak nodded, steering her toward a side exit. They were 10 feet away when a man in a gray suit stepped from behind a column. He was utterly forgettable, average height, unremarkable features. But he held something that made Beomsiak go rigid. A red envelope. Pressed into the wax seal was a golden crane with its throat slit. The man held it toward Opal. Mrs. Kwan. I was asked to deliver this personally. Beomsiak's grip tightened painfully. Don't, Opal, don't take it. But the man was still holding it out, and Opal knew refusing wasn't an option. She took the envelope. The man nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Her hands shook as she examined the seal. What is this? Open it, Beomsiak said, though his voice suggested he didn't want her to. Opal broke the seal. Inside was a single paper with Korean calligraphy, precise, formal, the kind that spoke of old power and old grudges. She read it once, twice, 3 times. He's back, Opal whispered. Beomsiak read it, his face going pale. We leave for Seoul tonight. Around them, the gala continued. People drank champagne, made deals, laughed. The quartet played Mozart. A waiter offered hors d'oeuvres, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding. Said Opal looked at the golden crane with its elegant, fatal wound. The triumph of destroying Marlin evaporated. Who is he? Opal asked. Beomsiak's grip was desperate now. I'll explain on the plane, but Opal, everything we've built, he can take it all. They moved toward the exit, Beomsiak already on his phone, speaking rapid Korean. His security detail had multiplied. 8 men now instead of 4. As they reached the doors, Opal glanced back at where Marlin had stood in handcuffs. It all felt very far away now. Very small. Whatever waited in Seoul made Marlin Vance look like exactly what he was. A petty con artist who got caught. The doors closed behind them. The last thing Opal heard was the quartet transitioning into something minor key, almost like a funeral march. In this story, you learned that cruelty always leaves evidence. And the people you humiliate today may hold your future in their hands tomorrow. What would you do if you were Opal? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to my Afro-Korean boss stories, right, Toady? If you don't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. See you in the next story.